Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Roberto Alvarez. I'm the Executive Director of the GFCC, the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils. The GFCC, it's a global multi-stakeholder organization. We have members that are corporations, government agencies, private sector councils, industry chambers and alike, and universities. We're here today for another GFCC Frame the Future conversation. Actually, this is a special session that says about the future of universities. We in the GFCC are deploying the Frame the Future series really to explore how 5 key topics will define the future of innovation and competitiveness: innovation, sustainability, resilience, partnerships, and inclusiveness. Back in 2016, recognizing the essential role that universities play as economic growth engines, we launched in the GFCC the University and Research Leadership Forum. Since then, we've been working with our university members, and we have created a series of documents, reports, and have been sharing knowledge across the globe on how to better drive innovation, how we could better work to connect universities with business, with government. Back in 2018, and my colleagues will share here some resources with you, we launched 2 groundbreaking products. One is optimizing innovation alliances. We made an assessment of the tools that universities have to engage in the innovation space. We also created another report, leveraging extreme innovation, really about how universities could play a role in moonshot-like projects. At the end of 2019, we started a new conversation in the GFCC, really looking ahead. What is the future? What would the future look like for universities? We were in some way disrupted by the pandemic in 2020, but we continued the work. In that process, we had 3 of our university members, RMIT University in Australia, Queen Mary University London in the UK, and the University of Auckland in New Zealand, stepping up and catalyzing conversations and creating discussion papers that we will share here, the link where you can find those resources, discussion papers about the future of universities. We're here today for a conversation around one of those papers, Universities of the Future. Professor Jean Madsen and Dr. Kate Roy from the University of Auckland have authored that paper, and we will hear from them in a few minutes. On that paper, they have identified some of the key trends shaping the future of universities. So our session today, we will really get started with Jim and Kate, and in a minute, I'll introduce you to all our speakers today. So Jim and Kate will make a presentation in the beginning, and then we'll have a conversation that will follow. The conversation part of our session today will be led by Professor Peter Smith from the University of Southampton. Peter is a close friend and someone who has been very active in the GFCC space, and thank you for doing that, Peter. We're very happy to have you here. But above all, we want to expand this conversation and have you involved. So please use the chat if you want to connect, to share any cases, any resources that you have. But if you have a question, and we hope you do, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will pull your questions. So let me briefly introduce you to the great group of people that we have here today before we actually get started. We have Kate Roy. Kate is a Senior Research Policy Advisor at the University of Auckland at the Office of Research Strategy and Insights. In addition to that, and we have Kate. Kate has a position at the Chief Science Advisor of the Prime Minister of New Zealand. So Kate, thank you so much for being here, for the amazing work you've done and the time you put into this. Professor Jean Madsen is the Deputy Vice Chancellor of the University of Auckland, where he oversees research Jim is a globally known researcher and scientist with an amazing track record in the field of materials and chemistry and nanotechnology. He has worked across the globe in Nordic countries, including my own home country, Brazil, as he's one of the top experts in the globe about aluminium and the processing of aluminium. He had a series of roles and working as a chief science advisor to the Minister of Business, Innovation and Employment in Australia, New Zealand, but also advising several things, including implementation of a synchrotron machine in Australia. Jim, we're delighted to have you as part of the GFCC here today. I already mentioned Professor Peter Smith from the University of Southampton. Peter is one of the leading scientists in the globe in the field of quantum photonics. He leads Southampton's quantum photonics group. He has co-founded tech companies that are in the semiconductors space, especially developing advanced technologies for quantum and associated fields. Peter, as I said, has been super active in the GFCC and was there in the beginning when we started this conversation about the future of universities. He has been featured in a variety of not just science journals, but things like Wired magazine. It's great to have you here, Peter. Joining us from Arizona in the United States, we have Minu Aip. Minu is the managing director and vice chair of the University Design Institute at Arizona State University. ASU has been recognized as the first place, the number one, the most innovative university in the United States for 7 years in a row now. Minu comes with an amazing background in organizational design. She leads global engagements for the University Design Institute, and she has been working with almost 70 universities in 20 countries around the globe, taking to the world some of the learnings and insights gained through the experience that ASU has in the US. It's amazing to have you here, Minu. From Athens, Greece, we have George Katsourenis. George is the Deputy Chief for Human Resources at Piraeus Bank, one of our corporate members and the largest bank in Greece. In addition to his position, George, until recently, his position at Piraeus Bank, until recently, he was the president of the Hellenic Institute for Human Resources. And he also is the CEO of the Center for Sustainable Entrepreneurship, where I think it's very timely in terms of the things that you work on and the conversation that we're having here today. So wonderful to have you. And finally, from the United States, we have my friend and colleague, Bill Bates. For those who are acquainted to the GFCC, Bill is the founding executive director, or was the founding executive director of the GFCC. He's the one who has really put together the GFCC network in the beginning. It's great to have you here, Bill. Bill has been doing a lot of work in relation to technology policy in the United States, manufacturing, cybersecurity, leading some of the initiatives that the U.S. Council on Competitiveness has in that space. Bill is an executive vice president of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness. He has worked on Capitol Hill in the United States and has been deeply involved with science and technology policy. I see that we have colleagues joining us from across the globe here, from Buenos Aires, from Arizona, from Saudi Arabia, from Peru, from Ukraine, from Brazil. Wonderful to have you here for this conversation. Bill, maybe if you could share a few words at the beginning. President Deborah Wynn-Smith from the GFCC was not able to join us, but you've been leading in the United States the Universal Leadership Forum that the Council has. So just for maybe welcoming everybody, would love to hear from you before we turn to Kate's presentation with Gene. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Roberto. And thanks to everybody who's listening. Thanks to our terrific panelists and presenters for being here. As Roberto said, I represent the Council on Competitiveness in the United States. We are a proud board member of the GFCC and are thrilled to be able to support its mission. I know we do have a lot to cover today, so I will be brief. Just wanted to share a couple thoughts with folks about how we see the role of universities vis-a-vis competitiveness today. Right now, our organization, the Council, has over 50 presidents and chancellors who are members of the U.S. Council on Competitiveness. I manage a program that is focused on the future of universities and some of the challenges that they are facing and myriads of demands they are facing from parents, from students, and from policymakers across the country. As is noted in the report that we're going to discuss today, a lot of these challenges existed before the pandemic. We had questions that we were looking at around the value of education, the linkage between what's being taught and the skills that employers are looking for, security concerns associated with the research being funded by US taxpayers that was actually benefiting foreign competitors, often through both legal and sometimes illegal means. And then importantly, ensuring that tax dollars that are spent on university research was resulting in jobs and product development and production in the United States. There is, in fact, a debate underway this week in our US Congress that is really a window into how these issues that I just mentioned have merged with those that have been driven by the pandemic and really the complete disruption that caused to the way that we teach and the way that research was being done. And because of some of the fundamental education and research shortcomings that the pandemic brought to the forefront, we now are seeing billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars being targeted for things such as broadband deployment in the United States, the creation of what we're calling innovation centers in regions that would not typically be thought of as hotspots of research across the country. A renewed emphasis on diversity and equity with hundreds of millions of dollars targeted towards minority serving institutions. But we're also seeing money being set aside to target those pre-pandemic challenges, including language around research security and threats from foreign governments and non-state actors. There's a lot of talk right now of the creation of a new directorate within our National Science Foundation that's going to be focused on commercialization and new disruptive technologies. We're talking about doubling grants to low-income college students to help them afford university. And we're talking about spending billions of dollars to update our outdated research infrastructure. So needless to say, today's discussion is important. It is timely. I certainly look forward to the conversation. And again, I want to thank Roberto and his team and everybody that's listening today for your time and your participation. And I'll kick it back to you, Roberto.
Thank you, Bill. I think there's one word that in some way summarizes what you have just said. That's impact. How to better impact the economy, create jobs, and move competitiveness. So thanks for sharing that. I was just checking people in the audience. We also have colleagues from Turkey, Canada, Zimbabwe, Mexico, and other countries joining us. So thank you so much. And now we will turn to Professor Jean Madsen, Dr. Kate Roy for their presentation. My colleague Vanessa, and Vanessa, thank you so much for making this happen. We'll share the presentation, and I think that we're ready to go to hear about universities of the future, adaptation and transformation to better serve the global community. Over to you, Jean.
Well, thank you, Roberto, and thank you to the GFCC for organising these sessions, for bringing these discussions together. And as Bill has indicated, there's quite a remarkable panel for this discussion. I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is that universities are enduring institutions. They are always interested in their future, and they have done a remarkable job, I think, over history of staying relevant. Vanessa, if we could move to the next slide, thanks. they've done a remarkable job of advancing the interests of the societies in which they're embedded, because they really exist at the pleasure of those societies. So what universities produce by way of graduates and by way of the knowledge that they produce has been valued by society. And I would look as a case study to the response to COVID, where certainly in New Zealand, universities have been a very large part of the national response. They have been advisors to government. Much of that advice has been taken on board, I have to say. And in the case of the University of Auckland, for example, with about 3 days' notice, in the first lockdown we went to almost 18 months ago, we provided almost half of the national testing capacity through teams based at the university. The other thing that I think we need to recognise is that universities increasingly represent global enterprises. And again, COVID provides a really interesting case study in the movement of knowledge across borders in ways that actually I think we surprised ourselves with regard to the speed of that exchange of knowledge and the new platforms like the one that we're operating on this morning for this meeting, which have enabled a global movement of knowledge much more rapidly than we had anticipated. And if we follow the evolution of universities through from their religious and theological roots through to the post-industrial revolution, where the rise of the natural sciences, medicine, engineering, turned them into technological powerhouses, really. And then right through to, I would say, the 1970s and 1980s, where they really became the corporate university model, if you like, engaged in global, for example, export education. And actually universities became more inwardly focused, more interested perhaps in their own survival than in some of the issues that societies around them were experiencing. COVID has certainly been a huge disruptor, and we've seen a very rapid response to that disruption, but really it has really accelerated things that changes that were already underway within the university system. And Vanessa, if we could move to the next one. Next slide, thank you. And we've seen this massive growth in online and hybrid learning, and universities have learned very rapidly, I think, that actually this has a global reach which they had not anticipated, and in some ways it has compensated for the loss of staff and student mobility across the globe. So many of us are operating now what you would call an offshore onshore model, whereby students are completing significant chunks of their degrees or, in fact, more modular qualifications in their home country before and even if they can travel to other countries to take up their studies. So the universities, again, have demonstrated a degree of resilience. And in fact, Bill captured a number of the issues that we face that this new world of more open communication also brings with it. There has been a seismic shift in, as I said, how knowledge is exchanged, how research, for example, the rise of the preprint as being a means of dissemination of knowledge. In the case of response to COVID, where the standard peer-reviewed and quite laborious process of disseminating knowledge across the world has been massively disrupted. And the last thing I'd talk about, I guess, in my session is the economic challenge which has been presented to universities, because the export education model has become such a significant part of universities. And I would look at Australia as being at the sharp end of this, where in the state of Victoria, export education is the single largest, certainly service industry, probably the largest export contributor to that economy. The result of that has been that the close down in terms of global movement of students, 40,000 jobs have been lost in the educational, the tertiary educational sector in Australia. And the impacts of that are far-reaching, actually, because the international student fees provided a huge cross-subsidy to the research activities of those institutions. So that landscape has changed very dramatically. And at that point, I think it's appropriate to switch over to Dr. Kate Roy, as we mentioned, who is actually from the state of Victoria and can probably add some additional insights to the Australian experience. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, I am from Victoria, and I can confirm that the Victorian and Australian higher education system has been really severely impacted by COVID and by the temporary collapse of the student market. Vanessa, could you move to the? Oh, you already moved to the next slide. Thank you. So one of the key shifts that Jim and I explored in our paper was the expectation that universities become more integrated and responsive to their communities. And I think we've sort of moved away, as been previously noted, that universities are no longer seen as an intellectual enclave where people work in isolation, but they're now expected to be much more engaged in their local communities. And I think this shift has implications for all aspects of universities' operations. In teaching and learning, the widening participation agenda means that many universities are expected that their student cohort reflects the diversity in their communities. And so in the case of the University of Auckland, we are looking at ways to increase the number of Maori and Pacifica students that attend universities at undergraduate level right through to doctorate. These students have had with low numbers across the student life cycle, and so the challenge now is to look at how we can lift levels of participation in these particular groups so that we are more reflective of the community. And achieving this requires a multi-pronged approach. It requires resources, and it also requires commitment from the university leadership. There's also the expectation that universities lead by example. So we've already heard reference earlier to sustainability and climate change. These are really big issues for our local and global communities, and universities are really expected to take the lead in these areas by walking the talk. So in terms of their operations, there's a big push for universities to become zero carbon in their operations, and also to take the lead on sustainability initiatives across campuses. I think the importance of the United Nations SDGs is another really good example, and there's a real call for universities to take the lead in addressing or trying to meet the SDGs. So, for example, in teaching and learning, universities are responsible for providing students with the knowledge, skills and motivation to understand and address the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And our researchers, of course, provide the necessary knowledge and evidence base and solutions and innovations that underpin responses to the SDGs. There's also a big focus increasingly on interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches. And as Jim's pointed out, the pandemic has really highlighted how universities can collaborate both within and also externally to meeting big global challenges. So interdisciplinary research is about researchers from different disciplines working together, and transdisciplinary is about those researchers working together but also with external stakeholders. And this is seen as a way that we can address major global challenges like COVID, but also other other looming challenges or current challenges like climate change and poverty and other sort of the big issues, the big wicked problems that our society is facing. And we've seen this in action. So in New Zealand, for example, we've seen epidemiologists, modelists, vaccinologists, behavioural scientists and policy makers all working together to contribute to the response to the pandemic. And the challenge now is to find how we can do that in other areas. And that brings me to the policy research interface. And so we've seen governments in many countries drawing on academics and researchers to inform the pandemic response. And Jim's pointed out that this has been the case in New Zealand. It's also been the case in Australia and in other jurisdictions, Singapore, for example. And this focus on research and evidence has elevated the profile of many of our researchers. So in New Zealand, many of our experts have fronted the media on a regular basis, and in some cases they've become household names. And a recent international study released just a couple of days ago has found that New Zealanders' trust in scientists is amongst the highest in the world. And I think that can be attributed to our research-informed approach, which has relied on independent experts, and it's given the public confidence in the government's approach to the pandemic. Vanessa, the next slide, please. So what can we do to strengthen collaboration and integration? So I think firstly, universities can look at addressing some of the internal barriers to engagement. Many of our traditional academic structures tend to promote siloing rather than collaboration. So if we look at the traditional faculties within universities and also our academic promotion criteria and what we incentivise within the universities, they do tend to encourage that siloing. We need to recognise the importance of strong disciplinary foundations. So while we want to promote interdisciplinary research and transdisciplinary research, we also need to recognise the importance of those strong foundations. So look at doing both. It's not an either or, it's a matter of creating opportunities for both cross-disciplinary research and that deep disciplinary depth. We need to look at our incentives, and so both internally and externally with our funding agencies, a lot of these incentives promote individual performance rather than team performance. A lot of our reward structures also externally and internally favour the publishing in academic journals and not necessarily that engagement with external partners such as industry, government and other community organisations. One thing that we could do better at is promoting greater mobility between the university and external partners. And so at the moment, it's not encouraged for academics to spend time in industry or with other community organisations, and that's something that we can look at fixing and incentivising, because there's a lot of benefits, for example, for an academic to spend time in industry in terms of learning, getting that deep understanding of what industry's requirements are, but also informing our curricula and addressing issues such as graduate employability. So there's huge benefits for academics to spend time outside of the university, but also the other way, having industry coming into the university. And then lastly, looking at the interface, that interface between industry, government and the university and other organisations. I think it's a two-way street, and we also need to look at how our partners can also understand better the work of the university. And so there's some barriers such as timeframes and intellectual property can pose barriers, and so we need to look at how we can overcome those barriers to work better together and to sort of reap the benefits of greater collaboration between universities and industry and external partners. And I might leave it for there now, Vanessa. Thank you. And hand over to Peter.
See that you,
Thank you very
Peter's
much.
muted.
I'm not. Thank you very much to Jim and to Kate. What I'd like to do is to come, if I may, to some of our other panelists and get their first responses to that very insightful analysis there that Jim and Kate have presented. So maybe if I come first of all to you, Minu, to just give me, if you wouldn't mind, 3 or 4 minutes of your initial thoughts on this before we get into some questions.
Happy to do that, Peter, and thank you. A shout out to Jim and Kate for a wonderfully thought-provoking paper that has led us to this conversation. It's so appropriately titled Adaptation and Transformation, but in the service of. And I think that's what is particularly important about universities, is they've been in service of society. As I react to the paper and what was presented today, and just the conversations that are happening around the world, I want to speak to a question attached to the paper about what might be new models. How might universities react to some of these trends that we are seeing? One approach would be for universities to reimagine themselves. And let me share with you what is happening at Arizona State University. So we are a university that's been around for a while, but we are no longer just thinking of ourselves as a university. We now think of ourselves as the ASU enterprise. So parts of what we do look like a university with colleges and schools, but there are other parts of us that are trying to organize ourselves to solve problems of social consequence through interdisciplinary research and partnerships and collaborations with business organizations and other organizations. And then we set up recently the Learning Enterprise at ASU. And the Learning Enterprise is focused on figuring out how to leverage the assets of the university, the assets of the whole enterprise, to meet the learning needs of human beings at any point in their lives. So now we're talking about alternative and micro-credentials. But this is one way to think about where universities could go, is could we reimagine ourselves and stay connected to the core of what makes universities significant, but reimagine and add and transform and adapt ourselves to address some of these issues. I think the space for alternative and micro-credentials is huge. According to Holland IQ, I think in 2019, we were already spending about $10 billion. Clearly, that number is probably greater today, and it is going to expand. So if universities choose not to engage in that space, we may cede that ground to commercial providers alone. And then there could be some questions of what that does for the community. When we think about what universities uniquely bring, I think separate from commercial providers, we bring an incredible breadth and depth of disciplines and the capacity to think in interdisciplinary ways. And also, I think when we look into the future and we think about how jobs will transform, entire job segments may cease to exist because of automation. But the things that will stay are those things that are likely to be uniquely attached to us being human. Leadership and collaboration and empathy and initiative and working together and cultural understanding and so on. And universities may be uniquely positioned to be in that space to really think about that long-term contribution to society. To the point that Kate was making, I think universities have the opportunity to be globally broad. Technology allows us to do that, but there is also a need to be locally deep. How are we taking the assets of the institution, research, teaching, responding to local economy needs, responding to the needs of our local governments, however we define local? It may be small, it may be at the level of a country, depending on where the university is located. But that globally broad, locally deep approach, I think, is going to continue to allow universities to be relevant and sustainable. But it isn't just individual universities reimagining themselves that I think is the way forward. Some of the conversation about credentialing and all these alternative approaches makes the assumption that technology is equally available and there is equal access to technology, which is really not the case. So an example of work that we are doing in Africa right now It's a project funded by the MasterCard Foundation, working with 10 universities across 6 countries on developing e-learning capabilities in those universities. But the model is really interesting. It's a community of practice-based model where these universities are coming together to learn from and with each other. ASU is involved as a partner, USIU Kenya is involved as another expert partner, but it isn't just a transference of knowledge and expertise from these external entities to the universities in Africa. It is community-based learning. And it is then thinking about the ecosystem that needs to go around this e-learning capabilities. So beyond what each university is able to advance and refine for themselves, it is including policymakers, ministries, accreditation agencies, business organizations, and other partners to say, what should that ecosystem look like? So, as I think about this adaptation and transformation piece, I think there are tremendous opportunities for individual universities to reimagine themselves, but I also would love to see us move in the direction of globally collaborative models where we can pool our expertise and our ideas and be of service to the global community.
Minu, thank you very much for those initial thoughts. We'll be coming back to many of those topics, I'm sure. If I could move to George, please. I don't know if you've got any first thoughts you want to share based on this before we come into some of the specific questions. I think are you muted, George?
Hi, thank you, Peter. Hello, everyone. Thank you, GFCC, and also Roberto and Kate for the insightful article. It is indeed a great honor to be part of this panel and discussing such an important issue. The role of universities in society has always been very critical. So during the last 2 years, the pandemic has violently disrupted the way we all live and work. And technology has rapidly emerged as the only solution to keep us connected, engaged, employed, sufficiently trained to meet these unprecedented challenges. It has also kept education alive in all levels. And although digital skills and tech-related fields were already a top priority, pandemic acted as the fuse that skyrocketed the existing market needs. So today, we all face a huge gap between current demand and supply of young talents with the appropriate skill set. Let me note here that one of the biggest problems that Greece faced in its economic crisis was the so-called brain drain. Around 400,000 people left the country, 26% hold a degree, and almost 70% of them a master's or a PhD. They are working mainly in business, finance, medicine, bioscience, IT, and engineering. So the gap mentioned previously in a small country like Greece is getting wider and wider. If nurturing future talent for the workforce in any economy is vital, then I think companies should be an integral part of this massive societal transformation affecting every single stakeholder. This is something that Piraeus Bank itself recognized early on, enriching its ESG agenda with bundles of activities directed towards many different stakeholders. However, the most important initiative in our agenda, which is the one I would like to share with you today, is Piraeus Bank's Project Future. Project Future is our innovative corporate responsibility program, which leverages Regeneration's expertise, a not-for-profit organization to bridge the gap between higher education and the labor market and support Greek graduates' transition to the economy. We have just completed our 6th cycle, with the 7th returning in October next month. Participants can choose from 7 pillars of specialization in order to be trained in one of them: digital marketing and e-commerce, project management, front-end web development, DevOps engineering, human resources, business intelligence and data science, and financial technology. At the same time, we help in participants' personal development in order to acquire critical soft skills that will lead them to the position they deserve. Let me give you some indicative figures. 3,250 young graduates have received training via Project Future and Generation program during the last 3 years. 1,150 of them participated in the specialization programs of Project Future, and 1 out of 2 graduates managed to get a job of their choice. The interesting part is that Piraeus Bank and Regeneration achieved to mobilize hundreds of Greek companies who actively participate in the career forums of Project Future. Most of these companies are partners of Piraeus Bank, either providers or customers who were moved by the initiative. In addition, the bank has assigned one of these disciplines to be led by the Athens University of Economics and Business, which is the most prestigious one in Greece as far as it concerns human resources management. All the other disciplines are being led either by small, very specialized training houses or by larger companies such as Facebook, Google, and EY. Project Future is an indicative example of how we can address an important problem such as the brain drain in Greece, mobilizing as many stakeholders in the ecosystem as possible.
Excellent. Thank you, George. Oh, maybe one last thought. We'll move on. I think we're going to come back to this topic of the brain drain and the internationalization and the globalization. So if you'll forgive me, maybe I was just going to ask Bill if you wanted to come in and make any initial comments, and then I'd like to move to a series of structured questions. So if there's anything very, very burning, Bill, then please come in.
Just a couple real quick reactions to a few of the comments and a terrific presentation. Thank you. One of the couple things that jumped out at me were, we are working on a big project here associated with the linkage between the STEM disciplines and the liberal arts and humanities. And because there is a real disconnect, we're hearing from the employer side who keep saying how important communication, critical thinking, problem solving, teamwork, what you'd think of as sort of soft skills are. At the same time, we have a lot of policymakers, particularly at the state and local level, who are sort of laser focused on STEM. And they keep as a result, parents and students keep hearing that STEM's the future. It's got to be STEM, 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 and we're losing some of that magic creation there between the merger of those two disciplines. So we're really focused on that and trying to raise the visibility of how important that fusion is. And then just the other real quick thought when you were talking about how important the role of the universities were to establishing scientific expertise and guidance in New Zealand and Australia, that has not been as true in the United States. And so I think it's not hasn't been a universal truism, even though on its face it sort of seems like it should be.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. I'm always pleased. I'm a laser physicist by training, so I'm always very, very pleased to hear about laser focus on anything. So that's very good. But the point about bringing together the disciplines, and I think that really brings something out about the skills. And George was telling us about the initiative led by Piraeus Bank, which is really thinking about how do you make that transition between perhaps a traditional university and places where people move into employment. But what we have here, I hope many of the audience have had a chance to look at the report that Jim put together, Kate and Jim put together. And that's within that, there's a set of questions. And what I wanted to do was to take this set of questions and use this to think about structure. So if I try and summarize the first of these questions, really it's asking the question: are we going to see a real differentiation? Are we going to see a situation where we have traditional comprehensive universities, which are some sort of premium experience, and that might be different from a more commodity provider if we took a kind of commercial perspective? And then that leads into questions about is there a bricks and mortar face-to-face experience, or do we move to something which Minu's already talked about, which really is this idea of customized modules, micro-credentials? But it also goes back to a point which Jim raised at the start, which is that we have universities at the pleasure of the societies and with the support of the government. And so we have to think about the way universities work, the way they're defined by the laws. So this is the first question. And I think if I could, I'll come to you, Minu, because you started talking about this idea of micro-credentials, and you talked about the way that Arizona State has already seen to transform itself. So if you could sort of try and share some high-level thoughts about where these things might go, and try and emphasize a few of the different, if you like, the poles that represent different ways things are moving, if that would be okay, Minu.
I'm happy to start that conversation. We've just launched into this universe of micro-credentialing, and a lot of players in the market. It's a very noisy market and only likely to get noisier. But when it comes to universities, I don't think universities should have to choose between traditional education and micro-credentials or new ways of teaching and learning. I think universities are positioned to do both. There is still a place for those traditional qualifications, some campus-based experiences, some online-based experiences for those traditional credentials. And I was just looking at some data the other day, and somewhere between 50% to 87% of jobs in the US require more than a high school education, some associate's degree or university degree. So there is still a need for those kinds of traditional credentials. I think the opportunity for universities now is to say, let's take what we have and then what can we build on? And one way to do it is not to try and credential in everything and be everything to everybody. One way potentially to think about it is, where can we work closely with industry partners in certain areas where the knowledge grows and moves really quickly? The university may not be able to respond as rapidly as a business organization, say in a technology space. So could there be some partner-based credentials in certain areas where you are really leaning on the business partner to bring in that new expertise? But to Bill's point, I think we need to come back and revisit this idea that discrete, atomizable skills is really what everybody needs as we move into the future. There are those skills that require time and practice and personalized support. And so I think universities are well positioned, if we can organize ourselves to try some new things, is to do the traditional well and think about what is the and to the traditional with partnerships and with us being really creative. And if I can just take a moment to say, we have to take back the conversation about the value of humanities and the non-STEM pieces. We have to articulate to society why that is important. I think that conversation sort of got away from us a little bit. We need to step into that space again.
Excellent, thank you, and that's a very important point about the universities, and it really providing leadership and thought leadership in so many of these areas. Maybe if I could come to you, Kate, just to get your thoughts on this first question, this issue of the comprehensive universities or the traditional model versus where things might be heading.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Minu. I agree with Minu. I think we can do both, and I think it will depend on the life cycle of the student. So for an 18-year-old going to university, I think that campus-based experience is still really important, and I think the pandemic has really highlighted this. While it's been great to have things online, I think people have been really craving face-to-face, in particular those students who are just starting out in their educational journey. However, if you're at the other end of the spectrum, if you're already in employment and you're wanting to upgrade your skills, I think credentials will, micro-credentials will become really important and already have. So I think, the trend towards lifelong learning, disruption in careers and the future of work will all lead to growing emphasis on micro-credentials and a differentiated model for universities. So I would agree with Minu on that. But I think rich in-person interactions are still a really important part of universities. So I don't think that campus-based model has gone.
Thank you very much, Kate. No, I think there's a lot to be said, and that in-person thing is so critical. Maybe Jim, I could come to you. You talked about the business of universities, the way that universities, and particularly global education. So we all understand there's a lot of value and a lot of importance in continuing education, lifelong learning. But the majority of the income of most of the university sector is either it's undergraduates, it's international students, and it's research, and those are the big pieces. So, Jim, if I could get your thoughts on this issue of, where you think things will go.
Really, the issues I think which have surfaced in this. One is certainly around that global movement of talent, which George indicated, and how universities have been actually major catalysts for this global movement of talent, and with it, the innovation and entrepreneurship which accompanies that. But in terms of the future shape of universities, it's a fascinating problem, because the economic model, as you say, Peter, particularly in this part of the world, and in Australia in particular, has been built around this massive export education market, where that has actually cross-subsidized a huge amount of the underpinning research. So you see the major job losses turn out to be in that the research precariat, I would say, the people on short-term contracts who are supporting the research efforts of those universities. So it has actually changed the nature of those universities, where you've had that, fairly major disruption in the international education market. And that actually challenges also the notion of a comprehensive university, because in Australia in particular, you've seen a government which very aggressively supporting STEM disciplines, for example, and have raised fees for degrees in the arts and humanities as a way of channeling students into a narrower span of disciplines which society perceives to be relevant to future economy, future well-being of the country. And in that, I think we miss a huge opportunity, because actually, I take from our own institution the example of, engineers putting together a proposal around improving New Zealand's infrastructure, physical infrastructure around cities. That's a classic example where engineers can build us a better bridge, a more earthquake-resistant building. The harder problems are in deciding what you want your city to look like, and what is the infrastructure that you need to build to support that concept of a city. And that is a matter for the social scientists, for the planners and architects, for a whole span of breadth of input into that question. And we risk losing that if we zero in on, well, the cash flow comes solely from degrees which governments will support, or where students perceive that they need a narrow disciplinary training. I'll leave it there and leave it for others to comment.
Thank you. Thank you there, Jim. What I'd like us to do, we've got limited time. We've got some really interesting questions coming in from the audience, and we've got topics I'd like us to think about. So from this paper, we can envisage, or we've seen that COVID has transformed how universities work. We've probably had 10 or 15 years of move towards online, and we've all got more used to working these ways. But to be a bit controversial and a personal example, today I had a meeting we're just sort of opening up in the UK, a meeting with one PhD student, another professor, and a postdoc. And after about 3 hours of us looking in detail at this difficult modelling thing, all in the same room, we made some progress. And my colleague, a fellow professor, said that was the best bit of science he'd done in about a year. because we were in the room and we were doing it together and it was so difficult. So I'm going to go to the second question, which is about how does the research side of things fit within these new and developing online models? And really, are we've all seen opportunities to collaborate differently. There's a very positive side to the way Jim presented it, but I think there's a real challenge, which is how do we get people together? And a phrase that's come up at some of the GFCC meetings is serendipity gap. That's the idea of where do we get these serendipitous meetings and how do we make things happen? And at least, so to be controversial, how do we address the serendipity gap and how do we get these online platforms to really work in a strong research arena? Maybe if I could come to you, Minu, on that question.
This is a sticky one. I think we all acknowledge through COVID that our technologies perhaps are ahead of where we are as human beings, and we might still need to break bread to make friends with people and spend that time to generate the serendipity necessary. I don't know that our technologies on the research side are quite as sophisticated as the technologies on the teaching side. So I still think there is some ways to go before we can truly evaluate technologies and say, have they in fact reached a point where they can replace the need for researchers to be together? So I think we are still, for the foreseeable future, going to need co-location of people, especially when we talk about interdisciplinary research. So much of the challenges that we see in this space is people needing to learn how to speak the same language before they can problem solve. And that is so hard to establish when it's a Zoom call or a digital connect. So there is need for, especially for solving sort of some more significant social problems, I think, for people to be together. Maybe there will be holograms or things where we can beam into each other's faces at some point. I don't know if that's a direction in which we're going to go. But I think on the research side, I don't think our technologies have quite caught up with our needs the same way the teaching side has.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Minu. Maybe if I could come to you, Kate, with that same, the second, how is this going to work for the research initiative, the research agenda of universities? Or is it going to diverge? Are we going to see
yeah, I think I read somewhere that 90% of collaborations begin face-to-face. So I think that highlights the importance of those in-person interactions, and particularly for early career researchers who don't have those, well-developed networks. So I'm not a technology expert, but I'm sure our researchers in augmented reality and virtual reality would have lots of ideas about how we can sort of progress these areas. But I think there's a couple of things. One is, as I've said, the importance of those initial relationships being established face-to-face at conferences and through serendipity, as you pointed out, Peter. So I think technology might have more of a role further down the track in terms of continuing with those research relationships, and particularly if we talk about bringing sustainability, there's now COVID has shown that we can continue interactions online. We don't have to travel those long haul flights for people in Australia and New Zealand to go to Europe. It's a huge impact on the environment. So I think there will be certainly pressure to work out how we can maximise those technologies in the future. But I think face-to-face still has an important part to play.
Thank you, Kate. If I could take the same question to George, because one of the real challenges, just speaking as a researcher, is I do research. I work within a discipline, and that was something in the presentation talking about existing disciplines. But what I'm not very good at is business development. If I was running a tech company, I'd have technologists developing, doing the science, making the things. I'd also have business development people going out there and talking to end users. And yet in a university, in the traditional model of a university, we're all quite, we're jacks of all trades. We have to do all these things, but none of us are very good at the business development bit and really going out and finding those new things. So existing collaborations can carry on. So George, if I could come to you with the specific question, maybe with your business and banking experience, is that business development side of the next generation of research. Do you have any insights you can share with us from the banking and the commercial experience that would be relevant to those of us within universities?
Well, thank you, Peter. That's an interesting question, in fact. What I would like to share with you is an initiative that we were running back with my other hat as the CEO of Center of Sustainable Entrepreneurship. 4 years ago, we were running a workshop to co-develop a new seminar on business development. And we were running this initiative together with a Greek university. So we would like to extract as many ideas and insights from potential customers. So we brought together people from the market, and we gave them a question, and we asked for as many insights as possible on how we can come up with this course. So after discussing in this focus group, they came up with many ideas and many insights, and we were discussing these insights with our colleagues from the university. And then we asked our colleagues there, we asked our customers, our potential customers, whether they would be whether they would participate in a course that will be developed together with the university. Well, unfortunately, the answer that came from the audience was that we would never participate in a course coming from a university, because the universities do not provide practical knowledge. They provide theoretical knowledge. Unfortunately, this is the fact for Greece. And I'm not telling you that currently significant progress has not been made towards market needs. However, it is still the dominant perception that universities provide theoretical knowledge. Therefore, the universities of the future need to become most open, porous, and agile organizations out there. And to this end, universities must develop new partnerships with leading companies, including banks, foundations, and all other research-intensive institutions. These partnerships are not just about transferring knowledge from lab to practice. They provide critical funding for faculty, for students to pursue research, to enable students and faculty to exchange ideas with the very best minds inside and outside the academia, and perhaps most importantly, help to prepare students to be citizens of a rapidly changing world. As I have already mentioned, the active cooperation with universities has always been part of Piraeus Bank ESG agenda. So we're doing a lot of things together with universities to make sure that all the experience that we have accumulated as a bank could be transferred to universities, and all the experience that universities have built to many issues and innovation insights that could be brought from universities to the bank could happen in a cooperation.
Excellent, George. Thank you. That brings up a really important challenge, and I'm trying my best to. I'm listening to everyone and looking at the chat, and there was a comment from Professor Dr. Marcelo Felipes, which essentially was talking about the disconnect between industry and the needs of industry and what universities do with their research, with that research direction. And I think you talked about the need for porosity. So if I could go maybe to you, Jim, because this is your remit in Auckland. And I guess the question here, we all have lots of individual initiatives we can talk about, but who is this? Where does the responsibility lie? Is it individual academics? Is it the government and the way they set the policy, or is this something within the gift of the university? What are your thoughts on how we address this issue of universities generate this theoretical knowledge and the skills, but they're not really getting in there with what industry needs? So over to you, Jim.
Well, actually, I will pass the question on to Kate. shortly, because she has been involved in a project where she's embedded in the office of the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor. And the object of that program is really to build a much better research policy interface with government. So if we look at the poorest university, one of the challenges that we have is government are very frustrated by interaction with academics who have a different timeline and a different concept of what their research means, and therefore their connection with the outcomes, how that is implemented into public policy, health policy, for example, is relatively weak. That interface is weak. And how do we improve that? And Kate alluded to the issue of mobility in both directions. That is, how do we have our academics, our younger researchers, doing internships within government? How do we have policy analysts from government spending time within the universities at that research interface? Kate, do you want to add to that with your experience?
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, I've spent some time talking to policymakers and talking to academics and talking to people working at the interface, both in New Zealand and also in the UK and in Australia. And what that research has revealed is that there's, I think it's highlighted the clash of cultures between government and between academia, and many of the issues are similar to industry, actually. And so, as Jim pointed out, different timeframes. Government want things really quickly because it needs to feed into a cabinet paper that they're trying to push through, and academic research traditionally takes a lot longer. So there's lots of barriers, but what it did highlight was that there's a great willingness on the part of government, certainly in New Zealand, amongst policymakers, to draw on academic research or to draw on evidence. And certainly there's an appetite amongst our researchers who really want to make an impact. They want to do research that makes a difference. And so they're really keen to feed that into policy. And I think in terms of what we can do about this, it's about creating more mobility, but also opportunities to mingle for people to, through seminars or through workshops, roundtables, that kind of things, more opportunities for researchers to meet with policymakers in a fairly low stakes environment, so they can talk about their research, and policy makers can talk about their issues or the challenges that they're facing. And also there's a big role for brokers, so those people that sit at the interface that can sort of translate some of the issues. I think that's another area these people play a really important role as well.
Thank you. No, that's great. I mean, maybe I'll take it to you, Bill, if I could, because the issue really here is, if we're going to be more responsive, you've talked about the society connection, but if we're going to be more responsive, if I come to you, Bill, to what industry need, who is the agent? Who's going to make this change? Is it down to me as an academic? Is it down to the funding bodies in the UK? Is it the university leadership challenge? Is it that we need the voice from industry to be telling us? What's your sense of where things are going? So over to you, Bill, on that question, if I may.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to your question is yes. To all of the above, it needs to be engaged. But the interesting thing here is this really is becoming a global competitiveness issue, because companies will go where the opportunity is. And if they're finding at a particular university or region that they're running against a bureaucracy that they cannot defeat, the intellectual property negotiations drag on for weeks and months, they will look elsewhere. And, we have global representation here on this panel, but I mean, so we know there are universities around the world that will bend over backward to welcome a company or a corporate partner, industrial research. And so it's not simply a matter of, just figuring it out eventually. It's becoming a competitiveness challenge for individual universities and for countries. But specific to your question, it really is an all hands on deck challenge, because it's one thing, we have university presidents as our members, and I've talked to many of them who have said, yeah, I am committed that we are going to be a better partner with industry and bring businesses in. But if the researchers don't buy in to that, then the day-to-day issues crop up there. And if the tech transfer office, has a legal team that's committed to the template they've been using for the last 15 years for intellectual property, and they don't want to change it, then that's a problem. So I think you really need to get buy-in, and, Arizona State's a great example where, from the top down, there's a focus on this. And I think that's really that's where the challenge lies. I mean, certainly without disparaging anyone's university, there is a lot of inertia in higher education. And sometimes it is a real challenge if this isn't in your DNA to do. So I do think it has to start at the top with a strong message and a commitment, but you really do have to get that buy-in. And that buy-in also, just one last quick thought, can get tied into some very difficult conversations around tenure and promotion and things like that. If no one is getting rewarded for working with government and industry, then it's hard to convince them that it's a priority. So I leave on that happy note.
That's absolutely right. Yes, if tenure conversations are still based on traditional metrics and publications, you're absolutely right. I think that's a great segue into taking the conversation on with Minu, because I think Arizona State has been, if not but one of the leading universities in getting things online and making use of these platforms that all of us have now had to engage with. But I think you're further down that route. And I guess what I'd like to do is move on to this fourth question, which is about which technologies are going to be transforming. We've all moved to something online. You've already discussed micro-credentials, but if you could just paint perhaps a picture of what you see coming down the road. The University 4.0, when we were kicking this idea around, was meant to be like Industry 4.0, thinking about how does the technology drive the way things work in the future. So, Minu, if I could come to you with that question, but if you've got any thoughts, particularly on the competitiveness advantage for universities in taking the lead, and why, or what has been the secret, the magic at Arizona State, which has allowed you to do that, then please give thoughts on that too.
Sure. I couldn't agree more with Bill that it's a collective effort with external pressure and housekeeping within the university level. And I would absolutely, challenge university leaders to take this on. I mean, if there is inertia because of a reason, right? And if we want to do things differently, it is university leaders, not just the individual at the top, but we're really talking about leaders across the length and breadth of higher education who need to step into the space. And some of that criticism, I will acknowledge, is valid, that universities don't always, teach students what they need to learn. But before I answer this question, Peter, if you'll permit, I would like to challenge the idea that the job of the university is to train people for specific task-based jobs. That a graduate is now being, the quality or the value of university education is being evaluated by, can a person do a series of tasks? I don't think that's what universities were set up to do anyway. So I think we want to be cognizant of that. But on the technology side, I think what technologies will make a difference will in some ways depend on who the university is and where they sit. Because in some parts of the planet, fundamental technologies that provide access will be the thing that makes the biggest difference. And it turns out that Zoom has become a great educational technology tool. None of us thought about it this way 2 years ago, but here we have Zoom or similar providers. So I think there will be one stream of technologies that are just providing access. They could be LMSs and ways for students and faculty to get online. For those in more sophisticated spaces, I think adaptive learning technologies have a particular role to play because it level sets the playing field. We don't assume that everybody coming into a learning environment is equally equipped to learn everything in that space. So adaptive technologies allow the pacing, learning at your own pace, you master the content before you move forward. That I think also allows for hybrid kinds of environments. I mean, we all agree that we still all like some in-person experiences, but adaptive technologies allow us to take some things out that don't need to be in the in-person experience and then build on. And I will confess I'm not a technologist, but as I look into the future, I think there is space here for technologies that can really personalize the experience. Can there be AI tutors, AI coaches who can help me as a learner figure out what is the on-demand thing that I need to learn, but also help me learn? Because I think the assumption that just content being available, we can all learn is not true, because then we would all just learn from the internet. We wouldn't have to worry about these other things. We need help to learn. So I would put some money on AI technologies that really are personalized, so that we move away from the mass commoditization, everybody gets the same thing, to what do individuals need to learn at particular points in their lives and careers.
Excellent, thank you, Mini. I think for me that question of AI, in fact, the guy that appointed me to my first lectureship went on to become a vice president at Microsoft, and he said the challenge with doing these things AI-like is unless you've got enormous data sets, you can't do them. You need to have the scale, and universities big as we are, we don't have the scale to develop lots of these technologies, and these adaptive things are hard to get right. Anyway, I'm steering the conversation. I'm not supposed to be raising new things, but I would be interested on this question of technologies. Jim, if you've got thoughts you'd like to say, what do you think is really going to be coming out of the, if we look forward 3 years to, maybe it's University 5.0 or beyond this Zoom era, which we just talked about. So what do you see as being the big technology steps that we could expect to see?
Well, I think the question was raised earlier around the distinction between content delivery and what a university actually does by way of educating and producing graduates, and with assets like Arizona State focuses on an entrepreneurship and innovation-based thing, because it's what are the tools which serve those kind of objectives and can address that in a new way. COVID has certainly made us think much more deeply about what the on-campus experience represents. And that's more than physical laboratories, for example. It's also, the studios and workshops that creative people work in, for example. And it's very difficult to look at the vision of the future of how technologies might help and enable. Certainly, we have very strong groups in areas like augmented reality, empathetic computing. Those are tools which are going to become an addition. Those are tools which are going to help, I think, in enriching that experience that the students have. But increasingly, I think we will see the differentiation of what you might call, content delivery, micro credentials which upskill in a particular area, but also that looking back at what is the fundamental role of and what type of people do universities need to produce for the benefit of society. And that is a much broader graduate, and that I think we're still committed to the bricks and mortar experience of being a significant part of that. So while Universities 4.0, and I do remember our discussions on this, Peter, much increases the range, the tool sets that we might have to enable that, don't think it changes the fundamental nature of the people that we want to produce as universities.
That's good. I'm very conscious of time. There's a very important topic which is the fifth question, which is really about global inequities. And there's a question came in from Walid Al-Somali from Saudi Aramco, really asking about how the leading world-class universities can work with the developing world. So I think if I could come first of all to you, Minu, just very quickly on this question of, thinking about the future of how we're going to be operating as universities, and what is this so super important thing about developing elsewhere in the world. You've already touched on the way Zoom is enabling. So any thoughts on that? And then perhaps quickly to Kate. And what I then want to do is just a few closing remarks from each of the panelists.
Peter, I would hope that we can move in the direction of more globally collaborative models. I think it's been hard historically for really true collaboration across universities globally. But maybe what we can take away from COVID is that collaboration is possible. The technologies we have are available. I think as we think about the inequities broadly, it can't just be university to university conversations. I think policymakers and ministries of education need to be involved, because sometimes they create barriers that don't allow the innovation that is necessary in institutions. And I think there is a third leg to that stool, and those are funders. So there are places where the inequities are not going to be addressed by universities willing themselves to be innovative. There's got to be funders who can be brought to the table. So I would see, policymakers, university leaders, and funders coming together in some interesting ways. I think then we can make some progress here.
That's excellent. That's exactly what this is a slight plug for GFCC, but that's exactly the sort of thing GFCC is able to do. Kate, if I could just quickly come to you before some closing comments, really with this question of how do you think that the evolution of universities is going to help address this global inequality?
I think the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have provided a really useful framework for universities coming together and working in transdisciplinary ways to address some of the issues in developing countries. I also think Minu's comment about working in Africa and some of the challenges around technology. And 15 years ago, I was involved in the African Virtual University, an initiative with RMIT. And one of the idea was that there was a network of African universities all working online and providing world-class education to a number of, I think, 15 countries in Africa. And one of the issues we found, I visited Tanzania at the time, and most of the students were working with CD-ROMs because the internet connection was not, there was power outages and there was issues with internet connection. So the use of technology in these situations has its limits in certain areas. But I think there's lots of opportunities, and I think the UN SDGs are a really useful a way of moving forward on that. Excellent.
Thank you. We're coming towards the end of the session. We've got some great questions. Jennifer asked about global collaboration, but is that more effective once personal relationships have been established? I think absolutely. Really good questions about other people coming. We haven't really touched this, but technology companies such as Cisco are very active and have real scale. So I don't think we're going to get onto all of these topics, but I do appreciate all of the input from the audience on those. What I'd like to do is just get, and it's literally going to be 60 seconds from each panelist. What's your takeaway? What do you think has been the most exciting thoughts or the most exciting things that have come up in this panel? So if I come first of all, George, to you, just really 60 seconds. What do you see as the most exciting or most insightful things that you've heard?
Okay. Well, I think that the most important thing that I can get out of this very important panel is that the universities have opened widely, and they are part of a society, and they are part of an ecosystem, and they work with the rest of the society to resolve problems and contribute to each one of the cells of the society. So we do feel that companies should play a vital role to this to this transformation of the universities, and we are ready to play this role whenever we are asked to.
Excellent, thank you. And it's very notable Perez Bank's strong engagement in this initiative and with GFCC. Maybe Minu, maybe I come to you next. What's your highlight? What's your 60 seconds of excitement from this meeting?
I think we're hearing a lot of talk about reimagining who we are and what we do. I'm also reacting to the need for us to co-design solutions with industry partners, with governments, and with other entities outside, but all with the goal of serving society. So I would say focusing on reimagining and co-designing solutions is an important takeaway.
That's the focus. Very, very good. Another laser focus is what I like to hear. Kate, what are your 60 seconds? What are your highlights?
I think COVID's really highlighted, it's an opportunity to reset and to look at the huge achievements in terms of what we've, global research, and also the opportunities associated with technology to further collaboration. So I think we can use that to those lessons to perhaps address other big issues like climate change and global inequities.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to give Bill a chance, and then I'll come to Jim for some final words.
Thank you. Just two quick concerns, I'll say. One, in the short term, I agree that universities were incredibly adaptable as the pandemic hit. At least in the United States, our elementary and secondary schools were not. And we had real equity issues come to the forefront as a result of that. And I think there are implications for colleges and universities for how they're going to have to catch up students that basically lost a year or two of their education before even getting to university. Longer term, I also agree with the discussion that I think universities can be both a hybrid, can provide hybrid opportunities that take the best of the pandemic and the best of the traditional. I worry that becomes a money issue, that it's driven by money and not by student opportunity and desire. In other words, it shouldn't be that because money is no object to me, I get the full college experience. Money is an object to me, so I get plan B, C or D. So just something I think we need to be really aware of and cognizant. Thanks.
Thank you. So the last couple of minutes before we hand back to Roberto to finish the session, just a couple of comments from you, Jim, please.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Very thoughtful and I thought far-ranging discussion this morning. The points that raised with me is the importance that our communities as universities are both local and global. And what the COVID experience and the accelerated move into collaboration technologies such as support this meeting do bring with them significant inequities, as has already been discussed. So early career research is enormously disadvantaged. Students who do not have, even within our local communities, who do not have access to the right technology platforms to continue their learning. So this has not played out equitably across our local communities and certainly across our global communities. So I think we have a responsibility to look at those technologies, what the new landscape looks like, and redefine how universities can best serve those communities. Thanks, Peter.
Excellent. Well, I've very much enjoyed this. I'd like to thank all of my all the participants, but I'm going to pass across now to Roberto, if I may, to come in at the very end.
Thank you, Peter. Amazing conversation. Thank you so much for leading this. I learned a lot. And there are three things that I learned that I want to share with everybody. First is that change is happening. I think that we're seeing that different things that were coming here today, different examples coming from the higher education space, but also from the business space. So it's happening, wherever we like it, wherever we agree on the pace, and even if we have different paces in different spaces. The second thing is that we have different realities, and we can see that from the questions that we got. And I think that what Jean just mentioned about global and local, we also had questions here about how to impact local communities, how to connect globally. So I think those two things, this connects us, local, global, will be highlighted as we go down the road. And finally, and especially from what you said and the things that Jim and Kate put on their paper, but also the questions that we got, it seems to me that we are all in search for the how. So it's like a in some way, paradigm moment. Everybody's looking for solutions. So the how is being shaped at this very moment. And having said that, we know in the GFCC, and thanks for highlighting that, Peter, that universities are essential to create value in society. This will continue to be, and this is at the core of innovation and competitiveness. Before we finish, a quick short note. Once again, want to thank for all of you, George, Bill, Minu, you, Peter, for leading this, and for your inspiration for the whole conversation around technology in University 4.0. As I remember, we've been together with Jim in Kazakhstan in 2019 and having that conversation. But also to remind everybody that we are continuing this work in the GFCC. Next week, and my colleagues Simone and Vanessa will share here on the chat, we will have another Frame the Future session. It will be focused on natural resources, and we'll cover an essential topic for the world today, something that you have mentioned in this conversation and that you have highlighted. So please stay tuned. And for those who want to check it again, maybe we could share it again here, Simone, the link for the paper that Kate and Jean have created, but also the video interview with Dan, in which they explore some of the ideas included on the paper. Before we go, a GFCC tradition, let's take a group picture. This is something that we do always. And I also want to thank my colleagues, Vanessa, Simone, and Riley, who are here and who made the paper possible, the videos that you've seen in this session. So please look at the camera and smile. Yeah, we can be globally distributed, but we can in some way share a human experience. So thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you next week to frame the future with the GFCC community. As you said, Peter, this is really about bringing together industry, university, government agencies, and civil society, and all of you. So thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Bye.